The date was June 15th, 2014. My team and I had decided to finally investigate the old asylum that stood alone and abandoned in Williamsburg, Virginia. This particular abandoned asylum had been the talk of the town for many years prior, with multiple stories and myths, the most famous being about students who snuck in and were found days later completely silent and void of themselves. According to the locals, the government followed up by launching an investigation, sending officials to uncover what had happened. But their findings were so grave they decided to sweep the case under the rug, hiding all students, parents, and officials who entered the asylum. The case was eventually buried, and the asylum was completely sealed off as toxic and harmful. The history of the asylum, while it was functioning, was still unknown, and the details of the students who explored it after it was abandoned are also unknown. My name is Jacob Benedict, and these are the details of how my team and I uncovered the terrifying secrets of the Williamsburg Abandoned Asylum. My team consisted of 5 individuals, including me, and at the time, we'd only been paranormal investigators for about 3 years. In these 3 years of working cases and seeing all sorts of things, we had come to the conclusion that despite whatever stories were told, they were just stories, and there really was no such thing as ghosts, creatures, or things that go bump at night. In this particular case, we heard first about it in March 2014, and finally decided to make the trip to the asylum in June. We got to the town late that day and didn't do much except lodge in our hotel and brief on the case. We were immediately struck by the inconsistencies and the lack of information about the asylum, which set this case apart from anything we had encountered in the past. It piqued our curiosity and fueled our determination to uncover its secrets. The next day, we headed into town and split up into 2 groups, with 3 of my colleagues heading to the library to try to find out more about the history of the asylum, while Jessica, another one of my colleagues, and I went around town asking locals for any information they had. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" I said as we approached a middle-aged lady in the street. She replied with,
"Yes, sure, but I'm in a hurry and I don't have much time."
"Yeah, no problem. It'll be quick. Can you provide us with any information on your town's old asylum?" I said. The expression on her face changed slightly before responding with,
"Well, I can't tell you much. If it has to do with that asylum, I know just as much as you."
Her response shocked me as I'd assumed a local would have a lot more information than we did. So I said, "Oh, I apologize. I had assumed since you lived here you'd know a lot more than I do."
"Well, I can see how you'd think that, but I'm sorry, I don't know much, and I don't think anyone you speak to would know much either. Ever since I moved here, I've understood that the asylum is something to stay far away from."
She paused for a minute before saying,
"Of course, there are still stories and ideas, but I'll tell you this for goodwill. Nothing good comes from that asylum. It's best you leave it alone."
Despite saying she knew nothing, something about this lady's warning felt real to me. I also noticed she mentioned she moved here, so I decided to ask, "So, before you leave, do you know if maybe there's anyone who grew up here and maybe knows something that could help us?" She looked annoyed but sluggishly replied,
"A lot of people grew up in this town, but the only one I can think of to help is Mary. Her family was involved somehow with the asylum, and she doesn't live that far."
After that, the lady kindly gave us directions to Mary's house, and in less than 10 minutes, we were standing at our front door. The house was extremely large and quiet, but it was obviously old, and I could tell just by looking at it that there hadn't been any repairs in years. We knocked, and in about 2 minutes, an elderly lady opened the door slightly.
"Can I help you?"
she said, standing behind the door. "Yes, we're looking for Mary. We wanted to ask a few questions about the abandoned asylum," I replied. The woman remained silent for a while before reluctantly inviting us into the home. The house's interior was just as run down as its exterior, with the paint peeling off and its floors confirming to me that the house was extremely old. Mary showed us a couch and informed us to wait for her here as she went to get what she needed. She returned a few minutes later with a file completely covered in dust and told us everything there was to know about the abandoned asylum was in there. After a while of talking, we discovered Mary's grandfather was head of operations at the asylum while it was running, and he passed away shortly after it was closed. She explained the file was put together by an employee at the asylum during an investigation that eventually resulted in the closing of the asylum. The case was handled quietly, and the family obtained the file after the asylum was closed, keeping it to avoid any scandals or leaks. However, when the kids went missing, the police asked Mary's father for information, and again, the file was used quietly, and the government found its contents too problematic and swept the case under the rug. Mary appeared emotional talking about this. She proceeded to tell us she'd uncovered the contents of the file after her father's passing and had been burdened by the guilt of keeping it all hidden.
I wasn't going to help you at first, but you seem like good people. I think you will do the right thing with that file and bring light to the activities of what went down at that asylum.
Mary seemed to have confused us for a journalist or some sort, so I responded with, Mary, there seems to be a bit of confusion here. While we do find everything you've told us intriguing, we didn't come here to get the scoop on this. We're here because people believe the building's haunted, and there are various myths revolving around the asylum. We'd hoped you'd know a little bit about its history. Thankfully, you did. But we still need to visit the asylum and find out what's really going on. Maybe there's even some truth behind the myths. Mary's expression had completely changed now, and she looked almost pale as she said,
Whatever you do, do not visit that place. Just take the file and release the truth.
She paused before grabbing Jessica's arm and saying,
That asylum is no place for people like you. The devil lives there now. The devil and all his demons.
Jessica quickly pulled back her arm and got up before saying,
Jacob, we should go. I think we have enough.
Mary began to frantically look around, saying,
Don't go. Don't go.
I got up and thanked Mary before leaving with Jessica and heading to the asylum. Little did I know, that would be the biggest mistake we ever made. I think it was about an hour later, and my entire group was standing at the gates of the asylum. We had met up earlier to discuss what we had all discovered. The group that visited the library didn't find much, but they'd managed to find the blueprints of the asylum. We told them about our discussion with Mary and proceeded to look at the contents of the file together. The file contained all sorts of horrible tests and experiments that were done on the mental patients in the asylum. These experiments only led the patients to slowly lose more of themselves until they were eventually void. As time passed, patients began to die, and the asylum decided to bury the corpses on its grounds. What really began to worry the doctor, however, was the living patients who had already been losing themselves suddenly began to have regular conversations with their dead colleagues. They would be heard laughing hysterically and calling the names of the dead in the middle of the night. It didn't take long before the patients who hadn't been involved in the experiments began acting the same way, and eventually, the doctors. It was as if all those in the asylum began slowly losing themselves until they were completely void and could no longer function mentally. As we looked at the old asylum from outside its gates, it became increasingly obvious nothing good would come from walking through its doors. The asylum was a 3-story building, and it covered around 50 hectares of land. The building seemed way older than Mary's home, however, and its exterior had already begun deteriorating, adding to its already eerie look. I continued looking at the building when I suddenly saw a man staring at us from a window upstairs. That's when I said, "Hey, who the hell is that?" pointing towards the window. Everyone immediately turned their attention to where I was pointing, but shockingly, there was absolutely no one there. "Ha ha, very funny," Mason said, assuming I was playing a prank on them. I was stunned and concerned because I could have sworn I had seen someone at the window. Everyone played it off as a joke and began walking into the asylum. I followed behind and tried to focus on the task at hand, but all I could really think about was Mary's warning. I stepped into the asylum. I immediately felt the temperature go down drastically. The building was extremely cold, and although I could tell by looking at it that no one had been there in years, it didn't in any sense feel that way. It actually felt like I had walked onto a stage and had 1,000 eyes watching. We continued walking deeper into the asylum, looking for anything that would explain the paranormal stories that surrounded the building. The floors were still stained with blood, and the rooms were filled with chairs and beds with straps for the patients. The group had stayed together exploring the building when suddenly I followed them into a room, and I was alone. At that point, I'd assumed they were playing a prank on me. "Guys, very funny," You've had your laugh, now let's move on and get out of here, I said, expecting a response. Instead, I was met with a deathly silence, and the temperature got even colder. I was completely scared and alone in the room when someone walked past. I immediately walked out to follow the person, but once again, there was no one there. At this point, I decided it was better to leave the asylum and wait outside for the others. I turned to leave, but I was met with the sight of a young woman in a gown and rotting flesh standing in front of me. My heart dropped at the sight of her, and she was so close to me that I could feel her extremely cold breath on my face. The lady only had one eye intact, while the other was being eaten by maggots and releasing a rancid smell. She slowly got closer and began to open her mouth. I closed my eyes and prepared for whatever was about to happen when I suddenly heard a scream from upstairs. I opened my eyes to see she was gone, and I immediately ran upstairs to see what had happened. I looked around upstairs for about 10 minutes before eventually finding Jessica sitting alone on the floor with her head in her hands. She appeared to be mumbling some words I couldn't understand, so I slowly approached her and said, "Hey Jess, are you okay? I don't know what's happening, but we need to leave right now. Come on." Jessica slowly raised her head and turned to me. She responded with, "But Jacob, we can't leave. We have to wait for the others so we can all go together." Jessica had messed up her hair in a way that had her face covered, and the room was so dark I could barely make out anything. But a part of me agreed with her, so I sat beside her and we waited. We had waited for almost 30 minutes in the dark and cold silence, so I figured it would have been a better idea to go look for the others instead. "Hey, do you remember where you lost the others? Maybe we can go find them and leave," I asked. However, I didn't get a response from Jessica. All I got was complete silence. I assumed she was probably just stressed out and didn't hear me, so I said, "Jess, we need to leave soon." This time, Jessica replied, once again lifting her head slowly to face me as she said, "Don't you get it, though? We can't leave. You have to stay with us now. All of us. Together." As she faced me, her hair was out of her face, and my heart dropped as I came to the horrific realization that I hadn't found or been with Jessica at all. The woman began to slowly chuckle before bursting out into full laughter. Her laugh felt like needles piercing through my ear, and before I could react, the room was full of other patients, also partially decomposed. They all joined in with her laughter and began walking towards me. Their stench filled the room, and no matter where I looked, their faces would appear, some more filled with maggots than others. At this point, I was completely lost and could barely hear my own thoughts. My body soon began to join in on their laughter. I tried vigorously to fight and gather my thoughts, but all my body could do was laugh and laugh and laugh until I realized I had lost myself. "Sir, are you all right?" I opened my eyes slowly in response to the voice I had just heard. A part of me wondered if I was still in the asylum hallucinating, but as I regained consciousness, I looked around to see a bunch of paramedics attending to my group and me. The police were also on the scene questioning Mary, who had placed a call to inform them we were in danger after we visited her home. I stayed conscious for about 2 minutes more before blacking out and waking up 2 days later in Eastern State Hospital, Virginia. Somehow, I had regained total consciousness and was aware of my surroundings. The rest of them, however, weren't so lucky. They all appeared to be conscious, but weren't in any way responsive to what happened around them. The police informed me Mary had called them, and by the time they arrived, I was found laughing hysterically right behind the asylum's front door. This would mean I hadn't taken up to 11 steps in the asylum, and everything I'd experienced was all a part of the trance. The rest of my group, however, were found a long time later and had remained unresponsive. It's been 9 years since my experience with the asylum. Jessica and the rest of my group were placed in a different asylum. I have since given up on exploring all things paranormal, and I visit them regularly to remind myself what I experienced was real and not just a bad dream. Therapy has been helping, but I still see the patients in my nightmares. And every day, I wish I had just listened to Mary's warning. I hope my experience has convinced you all that behind every myth, there is some truth. And it is only those who are suicidal that would doubt the existence of the paranormal. Hi guys, my name is Isle. Many in the town I used to live in may not know this, but I'm a hero. Without me, my two innocent little boys would have been victims of something terrible. A being so dark and strange that if it weren't for that being attacking my children, I wouldn't have had the courage to face it face to face. To tell you the truth, I always considered myself a hero. As a kid, I was always the least popular in school. My schoolmates treated me very badly and the adults much worse. My parents were not at all proud of me. They told me that I was going to be a failure and that I was never going to achieve anything. But with hard work and effort, I proved them wrong. Eventually, I got married and had two beautiful children. As soon as I finished high school, I went to college in Antigua. But working in the big city was always something that made me uncomfortable. After a while, I decided to go back to the farm and take care of it. I may not have had an ostentatious life anymore, but you know what? I was happy, and as long as my wife and two children felt that way too, there was no way I could regret this huge decision. I still remember perfectly the day I became a hero. It all happened one morning when I was returning from shopping for my two children. Their mom was at home waiting for me to make lunch, but when I parked the truck, I noticed something was wrong. The boys were running into the cornfield, which I have always strictly forbidden them to do, as I lose sight of them. I was worried they were ignoring me, and there had been many children missing in the last few weeks. I headed in their direction to scold them. But first, I was going to leave all the things from the store inside the house. Halfway there, the things I bought fell out of my surprise. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The scarecrow had moved on its own. It was impossible. Its bizarre straw face turned and began to look at me, then came to life and walked in the direction of the children. Oh my God, did you just see what I saw? No, it had to be a mistake. Is there a person inside the scarecrow? Honey, that's impossible. It's been there all day with a stick through it. Oh no, the children. Where are they? I just saw them running. Whatever it is, maybe it's behind them. Oh no, go save them. I'll call the police. Immediately after I saw that, I ran towards the farmyard, shouting at the children. I saw them in the distance and they saw me, but for some reason, they panicked and ran even more. I didn't understand why they were so scared to see me, but when I turned around, I realized they weren't looking at me. Behind me, the scarecrow was standing imposingly. Somehow the strange being grabbed me with its soft hand and lifted me up smoothly. It began to choke me with a strength that I could not even consider human. Slowly losing my vision, I was fainting from lack of air. Suddenly, the scarecrow threw me to the ground and with brutal force used his hand to lift me up and slam me to the ground over and over again. I felt like my back was going to break. If I landed too badly on one of those falls, I could break my skull. If this being wanted to kill me, it could have done it while it was choking me, but it didn't. This being, whatever it had, could have killed me. This being, whatever he had in front of him, was cruel. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to make me suffer. I had to get rid of him. I could not allow such a monster to be in front of my children. Suddenly, the scarecrow let go of me and tried to hang me to the ground. But this time, I was ready. With one big kick, I managed to knock him down and make him retreat a few centimeters. I took advantage of this small respite to run in the direction of my children. The trees were too high and I couldn't see them, but they started shouting so I could guess where they were. Dad, please, help us. Someone is after us. Behind me, I heard many noises. I was being followed by this being. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand how it could be alive, but I didn't care. I just wanted to protect my children. I got almost to the end of the field and found them on the side crying. Hey boys, don't cry. It's all over. I'll take you home and we'll have a nice meal. That scary monster won't hurt you, I promise. Please, get away from us. Daddy is coming. Don't hurt us. Poor kids. They were really shocked. They didn't even recognize me. I tried to grab them by the hands, but I felt something grab me from behind and threw me back against the masonry. I thought it was the scarecrow again. I was ready to fight for my children. But no, it was an ordinary man. My children ran to him. For some reason, they called him Daddy. Had they gone crazy? The man stood guard, waiting to attack me if I went first. But soon after, he was joined by other men I recognized from the neighborhood. They all grabbed me and started holding me. Did they think I was the one attacking the children? My own children? The men kicked me to the ground and held me against the fence. I don't know why these people that I'd grown up with, my own neighbors that I've known all my life, were doing something like this to me. But I didn't care. I was not going to let these people kidnap my children. Nothing was going to get me away from my children. In a moment of energy, I managed to free myself from the men who were pressing me against the fence, and I jumped towards the children with a huge leap. In any case, I was going to hug them and take them as far away as possible, no matter how far I had to run to get them out of danger. Suddenly, the man my children called their father caught me before I could get to the children. Once he caught me, we both fell to the ground and started fighting. Everyone was trying to separate us, but at the same time, they were trying to hit me. Little by little, I began to lose strength and the will to fight. I couldn't resist anymore. I had failed my children. I began to lose consciousness as I saw how behind all these people, the scarecrow was standing, staring at me with a huge smile. Soon after, the police arrived and they took me into custody. I told them everything that had happened, and for some reason, they didn't believe me. To make it worse, they went to my house and found a room with my 10 other children. I told them that they were my children, like the ones I had saved that day, but they didn't believe me. They took me to court and concluded that I have to go to a center for crazy people to recover. The doctors told me that I have a problem in my head called schizophrenia. I was told that I see and hear things that aren't really there, like the scarecrow. They also told me that I tend to take someone else's children and take them with me, and that with time, I will get better. How dare they tell me that my life is a lie? That I don't really have a wife or children, and that everything happens inside my head. I always tell them, yes, and pretend they are right. Only I know the truth, and the truth is that I am a hero. The world is not ready to know that there are things beyond their knowledge. I just hope that scary scarecrow doesn't attack again. As soon as I am free, I'm going to keep being a hero. I'm going to save as many children as I can. They say the honeymoon is supposed to be one of the best times of a person's life. Most believe the days immediately after marriage are seemingly perfect, leading most to expect the honeymoon itself to be nothing less. Believe me, I would have loved for this to be the reality, but sadly, that stereotype is far from the truth, as my honeymoon was far from perfect and is nothing but a horrific memory I would soon like to forget. My name is Benjamin Case, and on November 5th, 2010, I got married. The days leading up to the wedding and the wedding itself mostly consisted of my wife's nervous breakdowns and nonstop planning, but in the end, it all worked out, and it was finally my turn to make sure the only thing I was in charge of worked out without a hitch. I had spent months prior thinking of where we should go for our honeymoon and what to do. I eventually remembered the countless times my wife mentioned to me how badly she wanted to visit Mexico City, as it was her native land, and she left at such a young age she could barely remember her culture. At that point, it was a no-brainer, and I immediately planned for our honeymoon in Mexico City. We landed in Mexico 2 days after our wedding. My wife still had the ecstatic smile she got when I told her where we were headed plastered on her face. The package I booked for us online was a 7-day package. It set us up in a romantic resort on the outskirts of the town, alongside another couple and a single mother with her 9-year-old son. The beautiful resort stood alone and had a fairy tale view of trees and a lake around it. For the first 5 days, we were free to do whatever we wanted, so I took my wife on several tour buses and excursions to learn more on where she's from. We also went to see the carnivals and basically got a general feel of what her hometown felt like. In all of this, I noticed she couldn't stop smiling and seemed truly happy. At that point, I thought I'd completed my job and our honeymoon had been a success. But little did I know, it couldn't have been farther from the truth. Later that week, our resort manager informed us our package included a special experience for the last 2 nights. Well, guests, we do hope you have enjoyed staying with us this far, but it is finally time for me to tell you about the best part of your experience. Tomorrow night, we're going to have special performers coming to entertain you with our native dances and songs. This would, of course, all be during a feast of our best meals and cuisines. He paused to smile at us and continued with, the next night is usually an experience for everyone, but most enjoyable for the couples. This is because we take a deep trip in the forests late at night. I'm guessing the worried expressions on our faces were enough for him as he laughed and said, "Don't worry, it's completely safe, unless you believe in all the myths. But around 11 p.m., some of the rarest and most beautiful fireflies come out to mate, and in the process synchronize and create one of the most beautiful mating dances you'll ever see. It truly is beautiful. One of those things you need to see to believe." I was woken up later that night by my wife, who was frantically looking around the room and had a terrified look on her face. Confused, I quickly asked her what was wrong. She quietly replied with, "Did you hear that?" I looked around our room and listened intently, trying to figure out what she meant at that time, but the room was nothing but deathly silent. "I don't hear anything," I said. She responded with, "I know, but I swear I heard someone crying." The look on her face suggested she was in no way playing a trick on me, so I simply hugged her and took a look around the room to assure that everything was fine. The next day came and went by quickly, and before we knew it, we were surrounded by exotic dancers and food. My odd interaction with my wife was still on my mind a bit, but she seemed completely past it now, as she seemed to be enjoying their native presentations and food. The activities and drinking had everyone asleep at around 10 p.m. I walked in from having a shower and decided it was time I went to bed. I put on my clothes and got in bed. Not long after, I could feel myself drifting to sleep, when suddenly I heard a loud scream from outside. The scream was followed by what seemed to be continuous wails, and I immediately got out of bed and ran towards the window. My initial thought was someone needed help, but all I could see were trees leading to nothing. I kept looking as I was certain I heard a scream, but no matter how hard I looked, there was absolutely nothing and no one. The next morning, I decided to ask the others if they also heard the loud wails I heard the previous night. They all had no clue what I was talking about, so I decided to pull aside the resort manager and ask him, as both my wife and I had heard the same thing, and there was no way we were both crazy. The manager didn't seem bothered by what I had just told him. He simply explained to me that some of the locals who had lived in the area for a while still believed their folktales and sometimes tried scaring the people staying at the cabin by screaming at night. Something about the explanation didn't sit right with me, as I was sure what I heard the night before were the screams of something or someone in true pain. The day went by quickly again, and before I knew it, before he got a chance to respond, the whole place was deafened by a large shriek similar to the one from last night. And from how clearly we heard the scream, it was obvious that we were not alone. Silence followed, and everyone froze as we didn't really know what to do or expect. I could tell from the eerie feeling that began to fill the atmosphere that whatever made that noise wasn't human. A minute later, the silence of the woods was cut open again. But unlike last time, it sounded like someone was crying instead of screaming. Jackie, the single mother who was obviously now concerned for the safety of her son, decided to ask the manager if we could leave. But it was only then we noticed the horrified look on the resort manager's face as he mumbled the words,
"She can't be real. La Llorona. It can't be La Llorona."
No one knew exactly what he was talking about at that time or why he wasn't doing his job in handling the situation. The cries of the woman were becoming louder, and as we all began to get up to leave, the manager let out a scream before running into the woods yelling,
"La Llorona! La Llorona! La Llorona! La Llorona!"
I was panicked now as we didn't have any clue on how to get back to our resort or why the manager had left us stranded. Suddenly, a tall woman dressed in a black veil began to walk out from the water. She stood around 6 feet tall, and the parts of her skin that weren't covered by the veil looked like decaying flesh. Josh, the 9-year-old boy, immediately began crying, and the rest of us stood frozen with fear. The woman continued to weep as she approached us, before suddenly standing still and pointing at something. I looked around to see what she had gestured at, but my heart completely sank as I saw she had pointed at Josh, who was now hidden behind his mother's back. Jackie immediately began to plead with the woman, saying, "No, please, leave my boy alone. Take me instead. Please just leave my son alone." She was crying as she spoke, and the facial expressions of everyone around her indicated we all felt horrible about the situation, but knew there was nothing more we could do. The pleading only seemed to frustrate the woman as her cries only became louder. She then proceeded to approach Jackie and her son before offering a hand for Josh to take. The kid seemed to have entered a trance-like state as he suddenly stopped crying and put his hand in hers. Jackie held on to his other arm and cried without letting go. But in the blink of an eye, both the weeping woman and Josh were gone. Later that night, we found our way back to the resort where there was no trace of the manager at all. My wife was too scared to stay there now, so we said goodbye to the couple and hoped Jackie, who had stayed back by the lake, would be able to someday see her son again. The next day, we got on our flight back to LA, and in the coming weeks, we were contacted by Jackie to help spread the word of her missing child. It's been 13 years now, and Jackie still hasn't received any news on her son, Josh. And no matter how many times I've told the story of the weeping woman who claimed a child during my honeymoon, everyone refuses to believe my horrific honeymoon story.
It happened when I was 17 years old. I didn't have a great family, and almost everything else in life was crappy. My parents fought all the time, and I witnessed screaming matches almost every night. Most times when I had the courage, I would try to butt into their arguments and de-escalate things, but my parents would always reply with, "Go to your room, Matt." It didn't take long before they eventually got a divorce, and I was sent to live with my aunt, so I won't see things get ugly. Now, my aunt was a good woman, and I loved living with her, but there was something I enjoyed even more, and that was staying with her old neighbor, Lady Cassie. I know stereotypically old people are seen as boring individuals who stay inside knitting all day, but Lady Cassie was very different. She was an agile, interesting woman who was into a lot of things, and since I didn't have anyone my age living around the neighborhood that I could talk to, I always found myself having conversations with Lady Cassie, and talking to her was great. Her house was decorated with skin pelts, as she told me her husband was a dedicated hunter who had hunted every animal known to man. Now, even at a young age, I knew this statement was far-fetched, but I let it slide as her husband was dead and I didn't want to speak ill of the dead. During one of my occasional visits to her place, after we had talked for a while, I asked Lady Cassie if I could go to the bathroom. On my way back to the living room, I noticed a room with its door slightly ajar, and I walked in to see something odd. It was filled with what seemed to be skin pelts, and while some were on display decorating the walls of the room, others were used to design book covers and other things. I then heard the words,
"They're beautiful, aren't they?"
And I turned to see Lady Cassie walking into the room. She then continued with,
"My husband brought them home from a hunting trip, and he never told me what animal he got the pelt from."
As she spoke, I realized that I, too, couldn't guess what animal it was from, as the look and the texture of the pelt felt different. After looking around for a while, we left the room and we began to talk about other things, as Lady Cassie always had some great stories to tell. After a long afternoon and numerous interesting conversations, I finally decided to leave. Lady Cassie walked me out of the house, and as we were on her front porch, I noticed a shady, lanky man walking down the street. It was one of our neighbors, who everyone called Shady Jeremy, as the man never spoke. He also had a really scary aura around him that made people generally avoid him. Lady Cassie noticed me looking at the man, so she said,
"Stay away from that man, Matt. Some neighbors are meant to be avoided."
I then quickly replied with, "You don't need to tell me twice." After that, I said my goodbyes, and I quickly headed home. It was a bit strange, but when I arrived at my doorstep, I could feel someone staring at me. My eyes started to dart around, and it didn't take long before I noticed Shady Jeremy standing on his front porch and staring at me intensely. It seemed like his eyes were trying to tell me something, but I wasn't waiting to find out. Scared now, I rushed into my aunt's house and locked the door. It was really difficult to sleep that night, as all I could see was Shady Jeremy staring at me every time I closed my eyes. The next day, my aunt told me that I would be going back to the city during the following week to stay with my mom, as things had finally settled down between her and my dad. She then told me to get my things in order, as I'd be leaving soon. That afternoon, I went to Lady Cassie's house to tell her the news. She wasn't in her living room, but I could tell she was still at home as her front door was open, so I let myself in. When I had finally settled down, I noticed a diary that was decorated with a special pelt I had seen in that room. It was sitting on the table next to me, so I picked it up and started to admire it. Curious, I opened the book to read what was inside, but that's when I heard Lady Cassie say,
Each pelt is more beautiful than the last. I really need to collect more.
Confused, I wondered what she meant by that, as I knew she couldn't get any new pelts without her husband. But I quickly ignored it as I told myself that it was probably just an old lady mumbling to herself. Besides, I was there for another reason, as I came to tell her I was leaving soon. The look on her face was a mixture of sadness and disappointment, as Lady Cassie said,
That's very sad to hear, Matt. You're the only person here who's nice enough to visit and talk to me. I hope this isn't too much to ask, but I'd love it if you could come over tonight so that we can have one of our amazing conversations just one last time.
I immediately agreed, as I wanted to see her one last time before I left. On my way home, I didn't realize it yet, but the news of my leaving made me forget about the shady Jeremy incident that had happened the day before. I had started walking with caution ever since it happened, but at that moment the only thing that was on my mind was my abrupt departure. After dinner that evening, I made my way down the street to Lady Cassie's house, and as I was nearing the front porch, I felt a strong hand grab me by the wrist and pull me away. Alarmed, I looked back to see Shady Jeremy violently pulling me away. I started to scream, but he quickly held his hand over my mouth. In an effort to free myself, I bit down on his palm. The pain made him release me for a second, so I immediately ran towards Lady Cassie's house. I quickly entered the house, and I slammed the door, breathing hard. I then started to scream. Lady Cassie, please call the cops. Shady Jeremy just attacked me. Nothing but silence responded to my pleas, and that's when I finally realized that something was wrong, as Lady Cassie's house was now completely dark and it was lit with strange candles. Before I could do or say anything, I heard Lady Cassie's voice say,
You have been given the privilege to be the ultimate beast, and for that, I promise, I will only hunt you for 30 minutes. Bear in mind, child, that you have the right to run and defend your privilege. If you win, I will spare you. But if you lose, I'll take what makes you beautiful.
Confused and afraid, I racked my brain hoping to find a feasible explanation for what was going on. I didn't understand a single word Lady Cassie had just said, and I was still shaken up from being attacked by Shady Jeremy. It took me a while before I managed to stutter the words. What the hell is going on, Lady Cassie? But before I could get an answer, I felt a sharp pain sear through my arm. I fell to the floor, writhing and screaming in pain. I looked down to see the cause of the pain, and that's when I saw an arrow sticking out of my arm. Before I could do anything about it, I saw Lady Cassie lunge at me wearing an African-themed mask, and she was holding a machete in her right hand. I managed to dodge the attack before running away. I then frantically looked for an exit out of the house. I quickly headed for the back door, and I ran out through there. In front of me was nothing but the forest, and with no other options, I decided to run into it. As I ran through the forest, I heard Lady Cassie scream out what seemed to be a war cry. I felt my heart beating fast, and as I looked behind me, I saw a 60-year-old woman bolting after me like she was in her 20s. It didn't take long before she caught up to me, and with no hesitation, she brought her machete's blade down on my shoulder. Immeasurable pain filled me as I fell to the floor. Lady Cassie loomed over me now, and I could hear her breathing hard through her mask. A lot of emotions ran through my head as I watched her lift the bloody machete to land the finishing blow. I felt fear, pain, and anger, but the major thing I was feeling was confusion, as even in those horrific moments, I had no idea why I was consecutively attacked by both of my neighbors. I made my peace with God as I watched Lady Cassie bring down her machete, but before the blade could connect with my neck, I heard a gunshot, and I watched Lady Cassie slowly drop to her feet. Numerous people rushed towards me as I breathed a sigh of relief. I had lost a lot of blood now, but I managed to see what was going on, and standing over me were my aunt, the cops, and Shady Jeremy. I was taken to the hospital after the morbid incident, and my wounds were treated. When I felt a little bit better, I asked my aunt how she found me, and she told me that our neighbor, Jeremy, had come to the house and how he was aggressively gesturing towards Lady Cassie's house. She then explained how she finally knew something was wrong, as Jeremy proceeded to write the words, "Your nephew is in trouble," on a piece of paper, and that's when she called the cops. It was then I realized that our neighbor Jeremy couldn't speak, as he was dumb. A lot of things made sense to me after I was told that, like what happened in front of Lady Cassie's house. I really didn't know he couldn't speak, as I always thought he just didn't want to. After a couple of weeks, I was taken back home. The incident with Lady Cassie had been on the news, and my aunt told me that I had just survived a huge, ritualistic serial killer. The cops had revealed to her that Lady Cassie had murdered and flayed several human beings, as numerous pelts of human skin were found at her house. That's when I had a horrific realization, as I finally knew that the skin pelts I couldn't identify were human. I was also told that she carried out the same ritualistic 30-minute hunt with all of her victims, and how she skinned, preserved, and made human pelts of all the people who lost. Things began to die down after a couple of months, and I remember going back to my aunt's house and speaking with Mr. Jeremy. I apologized for misjudging him, and I thanked him for saving my life. I then asked him how he knew what Lady Cassie was going to do, and Mr. Jeremy then revealed that he too was a victim who had survived Lady Cassie's attack. He wrote all the details on a piece of paper and explained how he had survived the 30-minute hunt. It also said how she had let him keep his skin, but to keep him from talking, she morbidly cut his tongue out, and she threatened to kill his family if he said anything. He was too scared to talk after his own horrific experience, so he decided to avoid everything and everyone. But he couldn't stand by when he saw me going there that night, as he knew something was up and he didn't want me to die, so he did something about it. I ended up staying in touch with Jeremy even after I went back home, and while I had some serious trauma due to the ordeal, talking to him helped me get through it. It's been a very long time now since it happened, but this morbid experience has left me with a bad attitude towards neighbors. Nowadays, every time I see someone who's supposed to be my neighbor, I try my best to avoid them, as you can never know if one of the most prolific serial killers is the same person who tells you good morning every time you walk through your front door.
Many people say that cruises are some of the most relaxing and luxurious places a person can go. The cruise I went on was very luxurious, but considering I almost died, I would not say it was very relaxing. I wasn't planning to go on vacation, let alone spend a few days on a cruise, but the opportunity came by itself. Richard, a man I met on Tinder, told me he was the captain of a cruise ship, and to my surprise, he didn't lie. After going out a few times with him, he told me that he wanted to celebrate my birthday on his cruise ship, and that he would have a room ready for me. The idea seemed pretty good to me, since I had never been on a cruise ship, and since it was going to be crowded, I knew it was a safe place. The day of the trip, I noticed that I was not listed on the cruise list, nor did I have a personal room. I found it a little strange and even uncomfortable, but I understood and accepted. Richard was very kind, and I felt comfortable with him. I always spend my birthdays surrounded by a lot of people, and I didn't consider that Richard would be working, so I would be alone on my birthday. Anyway, he told me that he would throw me a little birthday party in the room, and the next few days would be spent with family and friends, so this situation didn't bother me. I walked around the cruise ship before going to the room. Richard was probably already in it, getting things ready for my little party. On my way to his door through a long hallway, something strange happened. Two strange female figures appeared in front of me. They both looked at me angrily. Where had they come from? It didn't take long for my question to be answered, as one of them appeared in front of me in the blink of an eye, and with superhuman speed and violence, grabbed me by the hair and dragged me across the corridor, away from Richard's door. Terrified, I ran as fast as I could. When I calmed down, I went to the captain's cabin, and somewhat timidly, I found Richard, who luckily was alone and still not in our room. I didn't dare tell him that I saw ghosts. He would probably think I was crazy. So I just told him that there were women near his room who tried to rob me. The man called with his communicator to the sub-captain, and with me, we ran to his room, but there was no one there.
I'm actually kind of surprised. Nobody usually steals here. All these people are very wealthy, and no one comes in without a ticket.
I know, it seems weird, but this woman was really scary. I didn't feel comfortable being here alone.
Oh, don't worry. I can take a break. I'm not the only one in charge of the boat. Come on, let's go into the room. I made sure to have everything ready for your birthday party.
Once we got there, I started to explore, a little scared, while Richard was looking for something in his closet. As I looked around the room, there were no birthday decorations or anything similar. Just a nice room. Maybe he had a big present stashed in the closet. Distracted, I glanced at the mirror, and with a muffled scream, I jumped back in fright. The two women were in the mirror. Both had deformed faces and stab wounds all over their bodies. They were both looking at me, but at the same time pointing at Richard. As I looked at him, I realized that he was holding something shiny that could only be seen in the reflection of the mirror. That wasn't a big birthday present. That was a knife. Suddenly, Richard began to walk in my direction, slowly, his face full of anticipation, and he couldn't hide his huge grin.
Happy birthday!
Richard, what are you doing with that knife?
You don't like surprises?
With an ear-to-ear smile. This isn't funny, Richard. I want to get out. The man had no problem with me knowing his intentions. I ran to the door in desperation, but it was locked. Richard locked it while I was distracted. The psychopath came running at full speed with his knife, and although I managed to dodge him, I fell and hit my head on the furniture. I was very dizzy, and Richard noticed. Knowing how helpless I was, the man got on all fours like an animal and started walking slowly towards me. I was about to die, and he was enjoying every second of the psychological torture he could give me. He was like a cat playing with a mouse before killing it. I tried to stand up, but I fell to the ground. I was losing blood from the blow. It was going to be impossible to escape or even defend myself. Without bothering to get up from the ground, Richard came towards me and started to run the knife across my body, grazing it without applying pressure. The knife was cold and sharp. I couldn't die there. I had to do something. I gathered all my energy, and the only thing I managed to do was hit him with a weak blow in the face. He not only didn't seem to be affected, he even seemed to enjoy the fact that I still had some fight left in me. Happy and smiling, Richard raised the knife to stab me. I couldn't even close my eyes. I could only see the knife coming towards me. Suddenly, to both Richard's and my surprise, I flew away as if something had thrown me. The blow was so strong that the door opened with my back. It was as if something invisible with enormous force had grabbed me and thrown me against the door as hard as possible. My body was more sore than ever, but I hadn't hurt my head anymore. Finding new energy, I crawled as fast as I could, screaming and screaming for help. Blinded by anger, Richard also screamed and ran at me with his knife, but this time, he couldn't do anything to me. Some security guards nearby stopped him before he could rush towards me. Richard had been impulsive, and this time he had been caught. As the men restrained Richard, I began to lose consciousness. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes were two women in his room, staring at me. Soon after, I woke in the hospital. The police officer told me that Richard had been arrested for attempted murder, but soon after the truth came out. Richard was convicted of murder. The victims? Two young women seduced and killed by Richard in his room, just like he tried to do with me. When I saw the photos of the women, I recognized them immediately. They were the ghosts that were with me on the boat. They never tried to harm me. They just wanted to get me away from that room. Even after they died, they didn't want me to suffer as they did. They didn't want my life to end up in the hands of the psychopath. I celebrated my birthday a few weeks later, this time surrounded by family and friends. Since that day, I am much more distrustful of everyone. You never know that behind a man who seemed generous, kind, and quiet, you could find a monster.